This episode discusses Kollontai's political development during the disintegration of the Second International, Kollontai's break with Menshevism, her struggles to overcome pacifist illusions, and her doctrinaire views on the national question. Kollontai becomes a Bolshevik and an important comrade of Lenin. Kollontai's work in organizing women brought her closer to Bolshevik figures Krupskaya, Armand, etc., and also internationally to Clara Zetkin, who would later become a firm supporter of Leninism. Kollontai's criticism of blatant revisionism and reformism while traveling Europe also brought her into conflict with the opportunists and closer to the Bolsheviks. Halvorsen writes, quote, "After Alexandra Kollontai returned to Sweden, a serious antagonism developed between her and the revisionist leaders of German social democracy. Her attack against supporters of Bernstein and opportunists in her book Around Workers' Europe was discussed in a very unfavorable tone by those who felt the critique had struck them. Karl Liebknecht, who was in opposition against the same leadership, acted strongly and warmly in her defense. Members of the left opposition sent her friendly letters and made denunciations against opportunist Scheidemann's attacks on Kollontai." Unquote. Kollontai also defended proletarian internationalist views and defended class struggle against the militarist bourgeoisie. Quote, "In March 1912, the historic Extraordinary Congress of the Second International met in Basel. The Balkan War was being waged at the time, and everyone felt that relations between the superpowers would soon escalate into war, unless the working class could mobilize all its forces to prevent it. It became the last great Congress of the old Second International. All the great personalities of the breakthrough years were there. Jean Jaurès gave his famous, fantastic speech in the Basel Cathedral. The leading men of German social democracy also participated in the Congress. Lenin fought like a lion for the line of revolutionary struggle against imperialism and war, and was supported among others by Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg. However, the opportunists had the leading positions in the Congress, though the tenacious actions of the left made its imprint on the accepted declarations. Kollontai spoke from the same podium as Hjalmar Branting, but fought for the completely opposite views. Branting supported the passivity line of German social democracy, while Alexandra Kollontai advocated the views of Lenin. The Basel Manifesto of the Second International, which Lenin describes as a, quote, "monument exposing to the full the shameful bankruptcy and treachery of the heroes of the Second International," unquote, contained an evaluation of the approaching war and a clear instruction to social democratic parties to prevent the approaching war through revolutionary struggle. The preface reiterates those principles, which had been accepted already at the Stuttgart and Copenhagen Congresses. Quote, "If a war threatens to break out, it is the duty of the working classes and their parliamentary representatives in the countries involved, supported by the coordinating activity of the International Socialist Bureau, to exert every effort in order to prevent the outbreak of war by the means they consider most effective, which naturally vary according to the sharpening of the class struggle and the sharpening of the general political situation. In case war should break out anyway, it is their duty to intervene in favor of its speedy termination, and with all their powers to utilize the economic and political crisis created by the war to arouse the people and thereby to hasten the downfall of capitalist class rule." Unquote. The Basel Manifesto further states, quote, "Let the governments remember that with the present condition of Europe and the mood of the working class, they cannot unleash a war without danger to themselves. Let them remember that the Franco-German War was followed by the revolutionary outbreak of the Commune, that the Russo-Japanese War set into motion the revolutionary energies of the peoples of the Russian Empire, that the competition in military and naval armaments gave the class conflicts in England and on the continent an unheard of sharpness, and unleashed an enormous wave of strikes. It would be insanity for the governments not to realize that the very idea of the monstrosity of a world war would inevitably call forth the indignation and the revolt of the working class. The proletarians considered it a crime to fire at each other for the profits of the capitalists, the ambitions of dynasties, or the greater glory of secret diplomatic treaties." Unquote. Right before the German Social Democrat Party voted in favor of war credits, quote, Liebknecht was in a state of constant, frantic activity. He became increasingly isolated in the party and increasingly regarded by his colleagues as mad." Unquote. Quote, "Opportunist Haase read out the SPD statement and was greeted, even from the conservative benches, by a storm of patriotic applause. People jumped up, cried, shook hands, and Liebknecht walked out. He was immediately surrounded by a crowd of socialists, reviling him as a traitor and a raving maniac. Alexandra and Liebknecht made their escape, pondering on how leftists in the SPD and the International might be regrouped to fight the military mobilization. Liebknecht still believed it would only be a matter of time before the party was liquidated and they could then come out in open revolutionary opposition to the war. That evening, as soon as the news of the vote was out, Rosa Luxemburg called a meeting of close friends and sent telegrams to 300 known radicals, urging them to come to Berlin for a vital conference. Clara Zetkin was the only one to send unreserved support. The few others who bothered to reply did so unenthusiastically. A few days later, a letter disclaiming the SPD's vote and signed by Rosa Luxemburg, Clara Zetkin, Liebknecht and Mehring appeared in 2 Swiss papers. On August 5th, the German socialist women's paper edited by Zetkin, Die Gleichheit's leading article, similarly denounced the vote and encouraged its readers to take part in anti-war demonstrations." Unquote. Clements writes, quote, "For years, the Second International had vowed to oppose any war fought for the benefit of the capitalist rulers of Europe. Now, when the time came for the Germans to make a decisive choice, the majority approved the military expenditures, justifying them as necessary for quote-unquote national defense. Kollontai sat in the gallery of the Reichstag that day and watched with disbelief as the illusion of an international socialist community died. And over everything, she wrote, like lead weighed the realization, they voted for war, there is no more international solidarity. The collective in which she put so much faith dissolved before her eyes, leaving her betrayed. I knew horror and despair," she wrote. "It seemed to me that all was lost. The atmosphere was so stifling and hopeless that it was as if a wall had grown up before me and there was no way ahead." Unquote. Kollontai wrote in an autobiographical sketch, quote, "The intoxication of patriotic feelings has always been something alien to me. On the contrary, I felt an aversion for everything that smacked of super-patriotism. I found no understanding for my quote-unquote unpatriotic attitude among my own Russian party comrades, that is, Mensheviks, who also lived in Germany. Only Karl Liebknecht, his wife Sophie Liebknecht, and a few other German comrades like myself espoused the same standpoint, and, like myself, considered it a socialist's duty to struggle against the war. Strange to say, I was present in the Reichstag on August 4th, the day the war budget was being voted on. The collapse of the German Socialist Party struck me as a calamity without parallel. I felt utterly alone and found comfort only in the company of the Liebknechts. Since the Bolsheviks were those who most consistently fought social patriotism, in June 1915 I officially joined the Bolsheviks and entered into a lively correspondence with Lenin." Unquote. Quote, "Alexandra began to study Lenin's thesis on war closely as soon as she arrived in Stockholm and struggled to come to grips with its uncompromising message. Social democracy was dead, this she accepted. True internationalists must reclaim the name of communism by creating a new international communist movement. What Alexandra did not so easily accept was that in this crazed epoch of imperialist war and mass slaughter, there must also be just wars, those of serfs and slaves against their masters, those of national liberation, and those of wage workers against the bourgeoisie. She did not, in other words, so easily accept the realities of the class war. However, the thesis did spell out for the first time an anti-war program which she fully supported. Socialists should demand that their parties vote against all war credits and withdraw from bourgeois governments. They should also establish illegal organizations where legal anti-war work was impossible, fraternize at the front, and encourage any kind of anti-war protest. She became increasingly enthusiastic about the idea of working for the Bolsheviks, and by the end of October 1914, Lenin wrote, "Heartily glad that Comrade Kollontai is on our side." But she still had many pangs about joining the Bolsheviks, and for many months remained in contact with a group of Mensheviks and ex-Menshevik internationalists. Alexandra's reservations about Lenin's call for civil war and for wars of national liberation everywhere were shared by most of the young Swedish leftists who met at the Revolutionary Club in the Carlsen Hotel. But although Lenin was exasperated by their simple, sentimental anti-militarism, he replied courteously to Alexandra's letters that autumn in which she aired her disagreements with him. "We hope that in struggling for peace, social democrats everywhere will confront their governments with their own demands, and that this will bring in its wake the civil war which you consider the only correct slogan now," she wrote at the end of October. Never before had Lenin written so many patient, tactful letters as he painstakingly spread his message of revolution. Quote, "You are not, it would seem, in full agreement with the Civil War slogan, but would assign it a subsidiary and very qualified place behind the slogan of peace." Unquote. Despite all her reservations, reading the thesis was, quote, "one of the most important moments of my life. I felt as though the wall against which I had been beating my head shattered, and I stepped into the sunlight, able to see my way ahead once more. Lenin's extraordinary intellect enabled him to see what was inaccessible to the rest of us. It was then that I understood his moral and spiritual fearlessness." Unquote. Kollontai wrote in her memoirs, quote, "At the moment when the Second International was completely paralyzed and bourgeois parties praised class collaboration, we heard Lenin's mighty voice. He thoroughly exposed the true character of the imperialist war and outlined the path to civil war and socialist revolution. In October 1914 I wrote my first letter to Vladimir Ilyich. He advised me to immediately contact those Scandinavian socialists who could begin implementing Lenin's policy. That was the beginning of my collaboration with Lenin." Unquote. Quote, Lenin responded on October 27th, "I am glad from the bottom of my heart if Comrade Kollontai has taken our position." He was referring to his theory that socialists should work to turn the imperialist war into revolutionary civil wars, wherein the proletariat would rise up and destroy the bourgeoisie. Kollontai had not accepted that idea, although she read several of Lenin's articles in October and began corresponding with him. She was drawn instead to the pacifist demands for an end to all war and for disarmament, demands which most anti-war socialists supported. Kollontai believed that peace would allow the class struggle to dominate national life again, and she thought that peace would be achieved by uniting socialists into an effective international opposition that could mobilize the proletariat to end the conflict. Lenin's theory would prevent unity because it would alienate socialists who were torn between their hatred of war and their desire to see their country offended. They would only be offended by Lenin's demands for civil war, which he coupled with defiant statements that socialists should work for the defeat of their nation's armies. On November 28th, Kollontai urged Lenin to accept the need for drawing all anti-war socialists together. Kollontai wrote, "Now we must have a concrete slogan for everyone close to us, and this slogan can serve the struggle for peace. I think we need to put forward a slogan that will unite everyone, promote the revival of the spirit of solidarity, and what can better unite the proletariat of all countries right now than the demand, the call, war on war. In other words, war with those who lead us to war." Lenin denounced Kollontai's position as pacifist. He wanted the guns now in the hands of the poor to be turned against the rich. War on war was unproductive or worse, regressive, because its adherents did not see the war as a catalyst for revolution. However, if she had disagreements with Lenin, they were minor compared to the rift with her Menshevik colleagues." Unquote. Quote, "Throughout the late winter and spring 1914, Kollontai worked with the Scandinavians, while trying at the same time to maintain her ties with all the various Russians, Bolshevik and Menshevik, who opposed the war. There were some anti-war Mensheviks. At the same time, she acted as a liaison in Scandinavia for Lenin and for Krupskaya and Inessa, who were then organizing a women's conference for the spring. Kollontai was still hoping for a general alliance of socialists, so she continued to call for a struggle for peace and for a new internationalism, without invoking Lenin's civil war theory. That stance brought her into long-distance conflict with Krupskaya, who refused to distribute some anti-war propaganda she had received from Kollontai because it was not sufficiently Leninist. Despite her criticism, however, Krupskaya continued to request Kollontai's help on the Women's Conference, a rump convention of the meeting originally scheduled for August 1914. Inessa and Krupskaya were hoping to organize the delegates there in favor of Bolshevik resolutions against the war. Aware of Kollontai's position, Lenin was still trying in spring of 1915 to gain her as a supporter. In April, she published a three-part series in Naše Slovo, entitled German Social Democracy in the First Days of the War, in which she bitterly accused the SPD of collaborating with the government to mobilize the masses for combat. They should have used their colossal, perfectly functioning apparatus to organize against the war. Krupskaya wrote to her shortly after the series appeared, "Vladimir Ilyich was extraordinarily pleased by your article in Naše Slovo." Lenin asked Kollontai to become a contributor to a newspaper he was founding, Kommunist. Her first and only article in the paper, "Why did the proletariat of Germany remain silent in the July days?" repeated the charge that the German workers supported the war because both their unions and their party favored collaboration with the bourgeoisie. Almost in spite of herself, Kollontai was moving close to Lenin. She had very little choice between the Bolsheviks and those Mensheviks who supported the war effort. As the combat became more bloody, it came more and more to dominate her thinking, and the Russian leader who seemed most resolutely against it was Lenin. The indecision of the Mensheviks contrasted unpleasantly with his absolute conviction and with the relentlessness with which he argued his position. On June 1915, Kollontai finally made the decision to support Lenin and become a Bolshevik. In the face of the all-consuming war, she forgot her earlier doubts about Lenin's vanguard theory, about his denigration of the spontaneous revolution, and about his stress on a highly centralized party. Having made up her mind to follow Lenin, she declared now that he was totally right, that his civil war theory would allow socialists who opposed the war to draw a sharp line between themselves and those who were vacillating. Thus, the theory had tactical value. It was a position around which people could gather, a prediction of the revolutionary potential in the war, which could also serve as a rallying point. Kollontai wrote in her diary on July 22nd, "This is not just analysis, this is tactics, this is action, this is a political program. Above all, in all countries, a break with all social patriots, a decisive and ruthless break." Lenin proposed a clear statement of principles, while other socialists fumbled for a new course and hesitated over disavowing their comrades, the social patriots. Kollontai had no more doubts. On August 2nd, she continued to praise her new leader. Quote, "For me, it is completely clear now that no one is fighting the war as effectively as Lenin. The war can be stopped only by means of an attack, by the masses, only by the will of the proletariat." Unquote. She had come over to Lenin, therefore, because she had given up her earlier goals of generating a broad coalition under the umbrella of general and therefore relatively inoffensive slogans. Unquote. Farnsworth writes, quote, "In her memoirs, Kollontai observed that she was still a strong pacifist in the spring of 1915. We may guess that her acceptance of civil war was made easier by the knowledge that Karl Liebknecht was making the same transition. Liebknecht sent a letter to the International Socialist Conference at Zimmerwald in September 1915 that the participants read aloud in the usual fashion to the delegates. Civil war, not civil peace, Liebknecht wrote. Civil war, that is excellent, Lenin exulted." Unquote. And Clements writes, quote, "Kollontai herself continued to debate with Lenin, even though she claimed to be his ardent supporter. Her first contribution to the Bolsheviks was a pamphlet, Who Needs the War, written in the summer of 1915 and translated into several languages for distribution to the troops. In it, Kollontai clearly adopted Lenin's notion that the international war must be turned into a series of civil wars, wherein the workers overthrew the bourgeoisie. At the same time, in her letters to him, she refused to abandon the call for disarmament. That was a pacifist demand, which Lenin considered silly. How could the workers overthrow the bourgeoisie without guns? Kollontai had adopted the civil war theory while still holding on to her earlier, and now contradictory, pronouncements against militarism." Unquote. Since 1915, Kollontai, quote, "acted now as Lenin's agent in Scandinavia," unquote, trying to get the Norwegian, Swedish and Finnish parties to support the newly created international organization of anti-war socialists, the Zimmerwald International and the Bolshevik positions there. Kollontai also traveled to the USA for the same purpose. Quote, in 1915, Kollontai undertook a 4.5-month speaking tour of the United States to build support for the left Zimmerwald position on the war and to try to find a US publisher for her English translation of Lenin's pamphlet Socialism and War. She attended a memorial rally for Joe Hill in Seattle and spoke from the same platform as Eugene Debs in Chicago. In all, she spoke at 123 meetings in 4 languages." Unquote. In America, Kollontai was forced to debate with Trotsky. Quote, Trotsky argued that the anti-war Americans should remain within the Socialist Party and publicize their views there, while Bukharin advocated Lenin's tactics of a full-fledged split with the compromisers. Kollontai stood with Lenin's position, but when the vote was finally taken, Trotsky won. Kollontai sourly described his victory as a triumph for the right wing. Unquote. Farnsworth writes, quote, the tension that in the future would exist between Kollontai and Trotsky was already apparent. In a letter Kollontai published in January 1916 in the socialist journal New Review, she included Trotsky with the Bolsheviks, a Russian group that, she told her American readers, was unclear and unsteady in its opposition to the war. Kollontai had heard from Lenin the previous summer that Trotsky was among those who were most harmful in their desire for unity with the opportunists. Kollontai informed Lenin that owing to Trotsky's arrival, the right wing had been strengthened so that a left Zimmerwald anti-war platform had not been adopted. Unquote. The reason why Lenin considered Trotsky so dangerous, and why Kollontai called Trotsky a Menshevik, is that Trotsky wanted to make compromises with social chauvinists and opposed a split with the servants of imperialism. This is why Lenin wrote in a letter to Henriette Roland-Holst, dated March 8, 1916, quote, what are our differences with Trotsky? This must probably interest you. In brief, he is a Kautskyite. That is, he stands for unity with the Kautskyites in the International and with Chekhyev's parliamentary group in Russia. We are absolutely against such unity. Unquote. Lenin wrote to Kollontai the following year, quote, what a swine this Trotsky is. Left phrases and a block with the right against the Zimmerwald left. He ought to be exposed by you, if only in a brief letter to Social-Democrat. Unquote. Lenin also wrote to Inessa Armand, quote, there is also a letter from Kollontai, who has returned to Norway from America. N.I. and Pavlov had won Novi Mir, she says, but Trotsky arrived, and this scoundrel at once ganged up with the right wing of Novi Mir against the left Zimmerwaldists. That's it. That's Trotsky for you. Always true to himself. Twists, swindles, poses as a left, helps the right, so long as he can. Unquote. Despite largely overcoming her Menshevist and pacifist errors, and accepting the Leninist position on the issue of opposing the imperialist war by turning it into civil war, into a proletarian revolution, Kollontai also held the dogmatic and erroneous ultra-left view that national liberation as a form of anti-imperialism should be opposed. Kollontai believed that supporting national liberation movements was class collaboration and only harmed the communist goal of international unity of all nations. She did not understand that the national liberation movements, mass movements of the vast majority of the world's oppressed, were a powerful and necessary ally of the communist proletariat. They would strike a mortal blow to the imperialist system, which was the contemporary form of international capitalism. She did not understand that by supporting the liberation movements of oppressed nations, those masses could be brought into the socialist revolution, while by opposing their liberation movements, the communists would only alienate these masses. Her view on this issue was too dogmatic and simplistic, another inheritance from doctrinaire Menshevism and the opportunist Second International. She did not understand that unity of all nations could not be brought about by forcing it, but by voluntary union. Voluntary union means that each nation must receive liberation and self-determination, must receive the opportunity for independence. While communists do not demand that nations secede or split into separate independent states, they must have that right, and in some instances they utilize that right. By receiving liberation and self-determination from the revolutionary movement, the oppressed nations realize that the revolutionary movement is their ally, and they voluntarily begin to support it. By receiving national liberation from the socialist revolution, the oppressed nations realize that socialism guarantees their freedom, and they choose to voluntarily unite together with other socialist states, whether it be in an actual state union, as in the case of Soviet Ukraine uniting with Soviet Russia, or the Baltic states joining the Soviet Union, or in an alliance, such as in the case of the Finnish Socialist Workers' Republic of 1918, the Mongolian People's Republic, or the East European and Chinese people's democracies making alliances with the Soviet Union. By giving oppressed nations the right to independence, they will voluntarily unite in friendship. By denying them this right, and thus nominally and violently keeping them together, they actually become hostile to each other, become disunited. Such unity, that is, keeping a nation as part of another state against its will, is not real unity between these nations, but is only a facade of unity and actually is oppressive. Denying the self-determination of oppressed nations is actually to slip into the position of national chauvinism, the oppression of these nations. Stalin said, quote, "Take Lenin's presentation of the question of the right of nations to self-determination, including the right to secession. Lenin sometimes depicted the thesis on national self-determination in the guise of the simple formula, disunion for union. Think of it, disunion for union. It even sounds like a paradox. And yet, this contradictory formula reflects that living truth of Marxist dialectics, which enables the Bolsheviks to capture the most impregnable fortresses in the sphere of the national question. The same may be said about the formula relating to national culture. The flowering of national cultures and languages in the period of the dictatorship of the proletariat in one country, with the object of preparing the conditions for their withering away and merging into one common socialist culture and into one common language, in the period of the victory of socialism all over the world. Anyone who fails to understand this peculiar feature and contradiction of our transition period, anyone who fails to understand these dialectics of the historical processes, is dead as far as Marxism is concerned. The misfortune of our deviators is that they do not understand and do not wish to understand Marxist dialectics. That is how matters stand as regards the deviation towards great Russian chauvinism." Unquote. In April 1916, quote, "Alexandra had received a series of letters from Lenin detailing her serious political mistakes, which were, according to him, of two kinds. For Alexandra, as for most revolutionaries, most notably Rosa Luxemburg, Nikolai Bukharin and Georgy Pyatakov, socialism and national self-determination were mutually exclusive. You say if it is imperialism we're fighting, then we don't need national self-determination or the arming of the people," Lenin expostulated. Quote, "That really is the most glaring contradiction. For the social revolution against imperialism, we need both one and the other." Unquote. How could she believe, he went on, that on the eve of revolution, the revolutionary class would oppose the arming of the people? Quote, "That's not fighting militarism, but merely a cowardly desire to avoid the great questions posed by the capitalist world. How can you say you accept the class struggle without understanding that at certain moments it must inevitably be transformed into civil war?" Unquote. She was painfully compelled to admit that her resistance to accepting the concept of armed revolutionary struggle was illogical and emotional. Unquote. Quote, "Lenin and Kollontai also disagreed about Lenin's theory of imperialism. The development of colonial liberation movements in India and elsewhere had caught the attention of socialists, who were not entirely sure whether such movements were a truly emancipating force or a bourgeois plot. Lenin believed that the temporary alliance of native bourgeoisie, proletariat and peasantry in a national campaign to expel an imperialist, European power from a colonial country was a positive step toward revolution, for it would weaken international capitalism. Socialists should therefore support aspirations toward national self-determination. On the other hand, G.L. Pyatakov and N.I. Bukharin, borrowing arguments from Rosa Luxemburg, argued that collaboration with the bourgeoisie anywhere would harm the long-term interests of the oppressed classes, and that socialists should not encourage nationalism in any form. Kollontai agreed." Unquote. Quote, "Kollontai was an exponent during the war years of Luxemburg's thinking on the national question. Luxemburg maintained, and Kollontai concurred, that national boundaries and appeals to nationalism were not only obsolete in an era of modern imperialism when the world was being transformed into a single economic unit, but even contrary to socialist teaching." Unquote. Quote, "Despite a lapse in 1917 when she encouraged self-determination in Finland, Kollontai opposed the concept. In 1921, she called the slogan of self-determination misleading bait." Unquote. Kollontai's views in 1921 will be discussed later, but she eventually realized her error regarding the national question too, and became a wholehearted supporter of national liberation.